My name is Daniel, I'm 28 years old, and yesterday I became a millionaire. I should be telling you this with joy, maybe even celebration, but the truth is, it felt more like a storm breaking over my head than sunshine. My Aunt Margaret left me everything she had, $2 million in liquid assets, a sprawling Victorian mansion on the outskirts of Boston, and controlling shares in her home decor company that spanned 3 states. While I was still drowning in grief, still trying to breathe, after losing the only person who ever stayed by my side, the unthinkable happened. The front doors of the lawyer's office opened, and in walked the very people who had abandoned me 15 years ago, my parents. They smiled as though 15 years had been a brief nap, as though they hadn't disappeared one October morning without a word, leaving behind only silence and scars. My mother's voice dripped with a sweetness that made my stomach twist. "We're your parents," she announced proudly, like she was claiming a prize. For a moment I couldn't move. Every cell in my body screamed with confusion, grief colliding with anger, longing at war with dread. But then my lawyer stepped forward, his gray suit sharp against the dark wood panels of the office, and their faces shifted instantly. The smiles drained, their skin went pale. They weren't expecting to see him, weren't expecting someone else to stand guard between me and their sudden claim to my life. That's when I realized this wasn't a reunion. This was a transaction in disguise. I want you to imagine standing at the center of 2 earthquakes, colliding the ground that raised you splitting apart, and the person who saved you being lowered into the earth forever. That's where I was yesterday. And if you've ever had to deal with toxic family members, suddenly knocking on your door after years of silence, you know the shiver that runs through your bones when motives are darker than words. Before I dive deeper into what happened, let me pause here to ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country down in the comments below. I'd love to know how far these stories travel, and if you've ever faced betrayal from someone who was supposed to love you, you'll understand why I'm telling this. Hit that subscribe button to join this community, because around here, we share the truths that others bury. I remember a time before all of this chaos when life looked normal. When Friday nights meant microwave popcorn and rented DVDs, when summer vacations were camping trips in worn-out tents, when Christmas mornings smelled like hot cocoa and cinnamon rolls. Back then, I believed my parents loved me, that we were a small but strong family. But even in those simple days, there were shadows creeping along the edges of the walls, shadows I was too young to name. Looking back now, I can trace every fracture in the glass, every whispered argument behind closed doors, every slammed phone call that ended with my father slipping out into the night. At 13, I thought I could fix it by being perfect. Perfect grades, perfect chores, never a complaint. But no amount of perfection can stop a storm when the foundations are already rotting. And that storm, it hit one morning in October, cold, silent, irreversible. The day I stopped being their son and became just a burden they passed along to someone else. This is where my story truly begins. For 13 years, I lived under the illusion that my life was ordinary. My name was on the class roll at a local middle school, my dad was the sales manager at a car dealership, and my mom taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 3 blocks away. We weren't rich, not even close, but we had enough to keep the lights on the fridge half full and traditions that gave my younger self a sense of belonging. Friday nights meant we dragged our thrift store couch cushions into the living room, made popcorn in the microwave, and argued over which DVD to rent from the red box outside the grocery store. Summers meant driving in our dented sedan to the state park, pitching a secondhand tent that always leaked when it rained, and cooking hot dogs over a fire that took forever to light. On Christmas mornings, my mom made cocoa so sweet it glued to the roof of your mouth, and the house filled with the smell of cinnamon rolls from a can. I tell you these details because when people ask me, "Didn't you see it coming?" I can answer honestly no. At least not at first. Childhood has a way of wrapping you in a blanket so thick you can't see the cold drafts sneaking in through the cracks. Still, the signs were there. I just didn't understand them. There were the hushed arguments behind their locked bedroom door voices, muffled but urgent. There were the phone calls my dad always took outside, pacing up and down the walkway, lighting cigarette after cigarette. There were the overtime shifts that brought him home at 2 a.m., reeking not of motor oil from the dealership, but of alcohol and cheap casino air. My father always loved poker, at least that's how it started. Just a friendly game with buddies on Friday nights tossing coins into a jar. But harmless games turned into weekend trips to Atlantic City, excuses that grew thinner every time. I remember waking up one night to hear my mother crying, her voice broken, as she begged him to stop before we lost everything. He swore he would swear on our family, but his promises were like loose change, tossed around, easily spent, quickly forgotten. And my mother, she changed too. Her once bright smile dimmed until it was only a memory. She started calling in sick to her students, spending whole days in bed with the curtains drawn, the house heavy with silence. Our fridge emptied more and more often. When I asked if we were going grocery shopping, she snapped that I should just make do with what's left. Some days she would stare at me so intently, as if memorizing my face, before breaking into tears and locking herself in the bathroom. At 13, I believed I could fix it. I became the model child. Straight A's, spotless chores, never complaining about wearing the same jeans until the knees tore through. I thought if I was good enough, maybe I could glue the cracks back together. Maybe they would smile again. Maybe Friday nights would return. But here's the truth. No child wants to accept. You can't bargain with a storm. I tell you this because I know some of you watching have lived in houses like mine houses, where silence was louder than words, where you carried the weight of adults who should have carried you. If you've ever felt that pressure, tell me in the comments. What did you do to survive it? Your story might be the hand someone else needs to hold tonight. Looking back, those years were the prelude, the orchestra tuning before the crash of the first note. And the first note was the day everything ended. Because one Tuesday morning in October, unusually cold for fall, I woke up late. My mom hadn't knocked on my door to wake me for school. The apartment was too quiet, too empty. And when I opened their bedroom door, the closet hung half-empty drawers, pulled out only a few socks left behind. That was the day my parents left me behind. The morning they disappeared, the world seemed to tilt off its axis. At first I thought maybe they'd just left early for work, or maybe there'd been some emergency. But then I saw the closet doors hanging open, clothes gone, dresser drawers half empty, and on the kitchen counter a scrap of paper written in my mother's careful handwriting. "Daniel, we can't do this anymore. Your Aunt Margaret will take care of you. We're sorry." 16 words. That was it. 13 years of my life reduced to 16 words and an empty apartment. I dialed my mom's cell phone over and over. Each unanswered ring was like a fist tightening around my chest. My dad's number had already been disconnected. I searched the apartment for clues, address books, emergency contacts, anything, but there was nothing, only silence. The first night I stayed up on the living room couch, waiting by the phone, surviving on cereal and hope. What if they came back? What if this was just temporary? But by the second day, the landlord came knocking, demanding the overdue rent. When I stammered that my parents were away, he gave me a look I'll never forget, half suspicion, half pity. He muttered something about calling social services. By the third day, I couldn't hold the secret anymore. At school, I broke down to the counselor, who immediately called Child Protective Services. That's how Miss Dawson entered my life. She was a social worker with kind eyes and a voice that reminded me of warm blankets. She listened, asked gentle questions, and made phone calls while I sat trembling in the corner. I overheard her say, "Your nephew has been abandoned. The alternatives are foster care or..." A long pause. "I understand it's sudden, but he has no one else. Tomorrow morning would be best. He can't stay in the apartment another night." That was how my Aunt Margaret came back into the picture. A woman I had met only twice, my father's older sister. She had never married, never had children, and according to my parents, never approved of their lifestyle. I didn't know if she even remembered my name. But the next morning she arrived. She pulled up in a sleek black car that looked completely out of place in our neighborhood. Stepping out in a charcoal gray suit, pearls at her neck, her silver hair twisted into a perfect bun. When she saw me standing there with my one small suitcase, her face didn't show joy, or even pity. It showed determination. "Pack what you can carry," she instructed, her voice clipped, but not unkind. "The rest can be shipped later." And just like that, my life as I knew it ended. The drive to her estate took 3 hours. I remember staring out the window as the city slipped away, then the suburbs, then stretches of highway flanked by trees already shedding their leaves. My aunt barely spoke except to ask if I was hungry or needed the restroom. I couldn't answer. I just kept watching the rearview mirror, hoping somehow I'd see my parents' car following us. But the road behind us stayed empty. When we arrived, the house loomed like something out of a period drama, a Victorian mansion perched on 2 acres, wrought iron gates, shutting the world out. Inside, velvet curtains swallowed the light antique furniture, filled rooms too large for comfort. My new bedroom was bigger than our old apartment. I should have felt lucky. Instead, I felt like an imposter dropped in the middle of someone else's life. That night, lying under a 4-poster bed, I listened to the silence pressing in from every corner. It was not the silence of neglect like my old home. It was the silence of rules and order of a life run with military precision. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and wondered if my parents were out there somewhere thinking of me. I wondered if they would ever call, but they never did. And so began a new chapter. One I hadn't chosen, one I didn't yet understand. My childhood had ended in a single note, and now I was stepping into a symphony written by someone else. It's strange how certain mornings stay carved into your memory forever. For me, it was that Tuesday, in October, the day I stopped being a son and became something closer to an orphan. The sun barely filtered through the blinds, pale and cold, like even the weather knew something was wrong. The apartment was too quiet, too still. No clattering dishes in the kitchen, no muffled voices behind the bedroom door. Just silence, thick enough to choke on. I padded across the hall, still half asleep, and pushed open their door. Empty. Closet doors hung open, half the clothes missing. Drawers pulled out, scattered socks, abandoned like casualties. And on the counter in the kitchen, that single note, "Daniel, we can't do this anymore. Your Aunt Margaret will take care of you. We're sorry." 16 words that gutted my world. 16 words that told me my parents had chosen escape over me. I remember the panic rising like fire in my chest. I grabbed the phone and called my mother over and over, straight to voicemail, my father's number already disconnected. I checked the mailbox, desperate for a clue, but it was empty. I tore through the apartment, searching for an address book, old bills, anything with a lead. Nothing. It was like they had vanished into smoke, leaving only me behind. The first night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom. Instead, I curled on the living room couch with the lights on, waiting for the jingle of keys in the door, waiting for footsteps, waiting for something that never came. I ate dry cereal straight from the box and cried so hard my throat burned. On the second day, there was a knock at the door. The landlord stood there, eyes narrowed. "Rent's overdue," he muttered. I stammered that my parents were away. He didn't believe me. "If you're a lone kid, I'll have to call social services." Fear rooted me to the spot. If they put me in foster care, how would my parents ever find me if they came back? By the third day, exhaustion broke me. At school, my counselor noticed my hollow eyes and trembling hands. When I couldn't hold the secret any longer, I told her. Within hours, a woman named Miss Dawson appeared. She had kind eyes, a voice like soft blankets. She knelt beside me and said, "You don't have to go through this alone." She made phone calls while I sat shaking in the corner. I heard fragments of her words, abandoned. No one else. Alternatives are foster care or a pause. I understand it's sudden, but she has no one else. Tomorrow morning would be best. She can't stay in the apartment another night. That's how my Aunt Margaret became my guardian. The next morning, a black sedan pulled up to the curb, gleaming like a foreign object in our rundown neighborhood. Margaret stepped out, her charcoal gray suit, crisp pearls, gleaming silver hair pulled into a perfect bun. Her expression wasn't joy, wasn't pity. It was something harder, determination. "Pack what you can carry," she said. Her voice clipped, controlled. Not unkind, but not tender either. I filled one suitcase with clothes and stuffed my backpack with photo albums and dog-eared books. I stood in the doorway of my bedroom, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars, still stuck to the ceiling, knowing I'd never sleep there again. The drive to Margaret's estate was 3 hours long. She asked only once if I was hungry, once if I needed the restroom. I stared out the window the whole time, watching the world I knew shrink in the rearview mirror. My chest ached with the hope that my parents might suddenly appear behind us, headlights chasing us down. But the road stayed empty. That night, in the cavernous silence of her mansion, I lay on a four-poster bed too big for me and realized my parents weren't coming back. Not tomorrow, not ever. And everything I thought I knew about family had collapsed in a single day. My first full day at Aunt Margaret's estate felt like stepping onto the set of a movie I didn't belong in. The mansion loomed with its velvet curtains, polished antiques, and portraits of stern ancestors glaring down at me from the walls. Every step I took echoed through the hallways, reminding me how small and out of place I was. Breakfast was served in a dining room so large I could barely see the other end of the table. Margaret sat straight-backed at the head, her silverware clinking softly against china. I hesitated, unsure if I should wait for her to invite me to eat. "Sit," she said, her tone brisk, but not unkind. Plates of eggs, toast, and fruit were laid out by a housekeeper who avoided making eye contact with me. As I picked at my food, Margaret studied me with a gaze that felt like an X-ray. "You'll attend Westbridge Academy starting next week," she announced, as if she were assigning homework. "Uniforms are ordered. Classes are rigorous, but you'll adapt." Her words weren't cruel, but they left no room for discussion. My life, it seemed, was already being rewritten without me. After breakfast, she gave me a tour. The library alone was bigger than our old apartment, lined wall to wall with leather-bound books. "You will spend at least an hour here each evening," she said, tapping her manicured nail against a globe. "Discipline and intellect will shape your future." I nodded, though my chest ached. I wanted to ask if she knew where my parents had gone, if she had any answers. But her face was a mask, calm, stern, unyielding. Something told me she wouldn't entertain such questions. The strangest part was the staff. A cook, a gardener, 2 housekeepers, all moving silently through the house like ghosts. No one spoke to me, except to say yes, ma'am, or no, ma'am, to Margaret. For the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to live inside a machine, every cog turning, every movement rehearsed. That night I sat at my new desk, staring at a mountain of schoolbooks Margaret had already arranged. I couldn't concentrate. My thoughts drifted back to the empty apartment, to the glowing stars on my old bedroom ceiling, to the unanswered question that clawed at me: why did they leave me? Lying in bed later, I tried to imagine my parents walking through the mansion doors, apologizing, promising it was all a mistake. But the silence was too heavy. I realized Margaret's world didn't allow for dreams like that. The next day at lunch, she surprised me by asking, "Do you resent me?" The fork slipped from my hand. I didn't know how to answer. Did I? She had rescued me from being swallowed by the system, but she was also the reason my parents had felt safe enough to vanish. After all, hadn't they left me behind precisely because they knew she would take me? "I don't know," I whispered. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's honest. Honesty will serve you better than resentment." Then she returned to her meal as if the conversation had never happened. That was the rhythm of life with Margaret, rigid, disciplined, but peppered with moments that hinted at something deeper. A flicker of care hidden under layers of control. At school, things weren't easier. Westbridge Academy was filled with polished, confident kids who smelled faintly of wealth and legacy. I walked the halls in my stiff new uniform, feeling like a fraud. When classmates asked where my parents were, I mumbled something vague about them being away. It was easier than admitting the truth. But at night, when I lay under the vast canopy of my 4-poster bed, I couldn't outrun the truth. I wasn't here by choice. I was here because the people who were supposed to love me had walked away. And no matter how fine the food or how expensive the books, the hollow space they left behind stayed with me. That emptiness became the quiet engine driving me forward. I didn't know it yet, but those nights would become the foundation for every choice I made in the years to come. And here's where I want to pause for a moment, because if you've ever felt abandoned, misplaced, or forced into a world you didn't ask for, you know exactly what I'm describing. You know the weight of silence. You know the ache of unanswered questions. And maybe that's why you're still here listening. Because stories like mine aren't just about me, they're about all of us. So let me ask you, have you ever been left behind by someone you trusted most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. The longer I stayed in Aunt Margaret's house, the more I felt like I was living inside a clock every hour, predetermined, every movement precise. Breakfast at 7 sharp, study time at 8, piano lessons at 3, evening reading in the library at 6. No deviation, no negotiation. At first I fought it. I'd linger in bed an extra 10 minutes or sneak a comic book between the history texts. But Margaret's sharp gaze always caught me, and her words cut deeper than yelling ever could. Discipline isn't punishment, Daniel. It's survival. Yet, survival didn't stop me from missing the chaos of my old life. Back in the apartment, mornings smelled like burnt toast because Dad always forgot the timer. Mom would hum old pop songs as she brushed her hair in the bathroom. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Now the silence of the estate pressed against me, polished and suffocating. School became my only escape, though not in the way I'd hoped. Westbridge Academy was brutal. My classmates carried leather satchels instead of backpacks, spoke in clipped practice tones, and seemed to glide through the halls as if they owned the ground beneath them. I stuck out like a sore thumb. The whispers followed me. Isn't he the kid who got dropped off? Or, no parents, just that old lady? Each word sank like a stone in my gut. I tried blending in by throwing myself into academics. Late nights I'd pore over algebra problems until my vision blurred, desperate to prove I wasn't just the abandoned kid. But the harder I worked, the more invisible I felt. My teachers praised my diligence, yet my peers looked right through me as though excellence from me didn't count the same way it did from them. One day a boy named Connor cornered me by the lockers. "Why don't you tell the truth?" he sneered. "Everybody knows your parents dumped you. Bet they couldn't stand you." His laughter rang louder than the dismissal bell. My fist clenched, but I didn't swing. Instead, I walked away, every step pounding with humiliation. That night, I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, asking myself the question I'd been avoiding. What if he was right? What if I wasn't worth staying for? It was Margaret who disrupted that spiral. Later that evening, she found me hunched over a blank notebook. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Nothing," I muttered. She stepped closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "You're not nothing. You're Daniel. You're mine now, whether you like it or not. And you will not waste yourself believing lies from boys who can't even see beyond their privilege." I looked up at her, stunned. It wasn't tenderness exactly, but for the first time I heard something like protection in her voice. That night, something shifted. If I couldn't belong to my parents, if I couldn't belong to Westbridge, maybe I could belong to myself. I began writing in that notebook every insult, every ache, every unanswered question. The pages filled quickly like a flood I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. Weeks turned into months, and the routine that once felt like chains began to harden into armor. I woke earlier than I had to. I studied harder than anyone expected. I practiced piano until my fingers ached, determined to turn discipline into power. Margaret didn't praise me, but I saw the flicker in her eyes when she noticed my progress. Still, the loneliness lingered. No matter how structured my days, the nights always ended with me staring into the dark, wondering if my parents ever thought of me. Did they miss me? Did they feel guilt? Or had I already become a fading shadow in their new life? And here's where I'll stop and reach out to you directly. Have you ever turned pain into fuel even when no one believed in you? Have you ever taken someone's attempt to break you and used it as the very reason to rise? Tell me your story, I want to know. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: silence can destroy you, or it can shape you into something unbreakable. And at 16, I was just beginning to choose which one it would be. By the time autumn crept in, the estate's long drive was littered with amber leaves, and I had memorized every creak of its halls. Routine had dulled the sharp edges of my grief, but it hadn't erased them. The emptiness my parents left behind felt like an old injury, sometimes quiet, sometimes flaring so painfully it stopped me in my tracks. It was during one of those restless evenings that I found myself wandering into the library again. The shelves stretched toward the ceiling, smelling of old paper and dust. I pulled a book at random, expecting poetry or politics. Instead, it was a thick, leather-bound journal. Its cover had no title. Inside the first page bore a name: Margaret Hensley, 1954. I froze. Aunt Margaret's diary. At first I only skimmed, but then words began pulling me deeper, stories of her youth, of a strict father and a mother who died too young. Notes about choices that weren't hers to make, of siblings who drifted away, of promises broken. By the time I reached the entry where she described watching her parents' car pull out of the driveway for the last time, never to return, I realized something that made my stomach flip. Margaret knew abandonment too. The next morning at breakfast, I couldn't stop staring at her. Her face was the same mask of discipline as always, but behind it now I imagined the girl who had sat in a quiet house waiting for footsteps that never came. That evening, when she noticed me lingering in the library, she said, "Books hold truths people can't say aloud." Her tone was pointed almost like a warning. I swallowed hard, realizing she must know I'd seen her words. But she didn't scold me. She only added, "Sometimes survival means writing instead of speaking." It was the closest thing to intimacy I'd ever shared with her. Around the same time, school grew harsher. Connor and his friends had sharpened their cruelty into something systematic, slipping notes into my locker with drawings of a boy crying alone, whispering unwanted whenever I passed. One day I opened my notebook in class to find a scrawled message. "Even your aunt doesn't love you. She just tolerates you." My chest burned. That night I nearly ripped the diary apart to confront Margaret with the truth demand that she tell me why she took me in if she couldn't even offer kindness. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the entry about her own childhood wounds. Maybe it was the look she'd given me in the library. Instead, I doubled down. Every insult became another reason to outwork them. I threw myself into debate teams, shocking everyone, including myself, by making it to regionals. For the first time, my voice didn't feel like a liability. It felt like a weapon. Margaret showed up at the final round unannounced, sitting stiffly in the back row. When I caught her eye after winning, she gave the smallest nod. Not applause, not a smile, just a nod. And somehow it meant more than all the trophies in the world. That night when we got home, she said quietly, "I see your father in you, and your mother's stubbornness." The words were a gift and a gift because it was acknowledgement, a curse because it reminded me of what I'd lost. Still, I carried them with me like armor. If I was a blend of the two people who'd left me, then maybe I wasn't as forgettable as I feared. Maybe I was something worth remembering. And that's why I want to pause here and ask you, have you ever discovered something about someone that suddenly made their coldness make sense? Did it change the way you saw them? Because in that moment, reading Margaret's words and hearing her faint praise, I realized that the people who hurt us are often carrying their own broken pieces. And sometimes survival isn't about fixing them. It's about choosing what we do with the shards they leave behind. Winter at Westbridge was brutal. The ivy-covered buildings looked beautiful under frost, but the cold seeped into your bones, and for me, into my spirit. Each morning, the walk from the estate to the academy felt longer, every breath cutting like glass in my lungs. By then, I had already built a reputation, hardworking, quiet, someone who refused to break even under constant whispers. But Connor and his pack weren't finished. One snowy afternoon, I walked into the cafeteria to find my tray waiting on the table, piled with mashed potatoes sculpted into the shape of a tombstone. Scrawled across the surface in ketchup, "R.I.P. Danny, unwanted forever." The laughter erupted like fireworks. My face burned, but I forced myself to sit down at another table, lifting my fork as though nothing had happened. My hands shook the whole time. That night I nearly gave up. The thought haunted me, maybe they were right. Maybe I was doomed to be the unwanted boy who didn't belong anywhere. But something inside, something Margaret's rigid training had carved into me, whispered back, "Prove them wrong." I set myself a new mission. I would win the science fair, a competition everyone at Westbridge cared about. It wasn't just about grades, it was prestige scholarships, the chance to etch your name in the academy's history. I threw myself into it with relentless focus. I built a project on renewable energy using small-scale wind turbines, working late nights in the garage, my fingers freezing my mind alight. But here's the twist: Connor tried to sabotage me. A week before the fair, I discovered wires cut cleanly from my prototype. Rage flooded me. I confronted him in the hallway, my voice shaking. "Why? What are you so afraid of?" he smirked. "Of you pretending to matter." For once, I didn't walk away. I rebuilt the project piece by piece, nights stretching until dawn. On the day of the fair, my presentation didn't just function, it thrived. The judges applauded, teachers nodded, and when they announced my name as the winner, the roar in my chest drowned out every sneer I'd ever endured. That evening, back at the estate, Margaret waited at the top of the stairs. She didn't smile. Instead, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photograph of my parents younger, holding me as a baby. On the back, written in her neat cursive, "You come from resilience. Don't forget it." I stared at it for what felt like hours. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't healing, but it was acknowledgement. And maybe that was enough to keep going. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something shifting. Teachers who once overlooked me began to ask my opinion. A few classmates even offered congratulations, though Connor's glare burned holes in my back. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't just the kid who'd been left behind. I was Daniel, the boy who wouldn't fold. But deep down, the question still haunted me: if my parents could see me now, would they care? Or had they buried me in their past, the same way Connor buried insults in ketchup? Before I end this part, I want to turn it to you. Have you ever had someone try to break what you built, only for their attempt to light an even bigger fire in you? Did you let their sabotage define you, or did you rebuild stronger? Because that winter, with frozen fingers and sleepless nights, I learned a truth I carry even now. Sometimes the cruelest people hand you the sharpest tools, and what you carve with them, that's where survival turns into strength. By spring, the halls of Westbridge no longer felt like a battlefield. They felt like a stage. I walked with my head higher, not because the whispers were gone. Connor still hissed unwanted under his breath, but because I finally carried proof that I was more than their mockery. I had my science fair trophy, my debate medals, and most importantly, my own voice. But the strange thing about victories, they don't silence the questions inside you. If anything, they make them louder. Late one night, while studying in the estate library, I found another diary, not Margaret's this time, but tucked away in a chest beneath old tax records. My father's handwriting. My chest tightened as I read the first line. For the day Daniel asks why. The entries were uneven, written in bursts. They spoke of dreams he once had, of moving west, of buying land, of building something with his own hands. But woven into them were darker truths, mounting debts arguments with my mother about responsibility, fear of failure. And then, in a final entry, dated just weeks before the accident, if the worst happens, I hope Daniel will someday understand that leaving wasn't cowardice. It was desperation. I stared at those words until they blurred. Was it possible, had my parents not abandoned me, but simply been crushed under weight I never saw? That night the house seemed to shift around me. Every creak in the floorboards carried a new meaning. The next day at school during history class, my mind kept circling back to those journals. My hand shook as I took notes. When Connor noticed, he whispered, "Still haunted, huh? Maybe ghosts are the only ones who'll claim you." This time I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Better haunted than hollow." His smirk faltered. For once I had unsettled him. That small moment changed something in me. The truth was messy. I still didn't fully know whether my parents had chosen me or abandoned me, but the search for answers gave me a new kind of fuel. Not the desperate need to prove myself to classmates, but the drive to uncover the story my family had left behind. And here's where I want to draw you in. Have you ever stumbled on a fragment of truth that made you question everything you thought you knew about someone you loved? Because this was my turning point. I couldn't stop. I needed to know more. What else was buried in this house? What else had Margaret locked away in silence? And most importantly, what if the story I'd been told all my life was a lie? I didn't know it yet, but following that trail would uncover secrets bigger than schoolyard cruelty or cold relatives. Secrets that would change not just how I saw my family, but how I saw myself. So stay with me, because what comes next isn't just survival, it's revelation. And sometimes revelation burns hotter than revenge. The night after I discovered my father's diary, I couldn't sleep. The words kept pulsing in my head. If the worst happens, I hope Daniel will someday understand. Understand what? That leaving a child behind was noble. That desperation excused the silence, the absence. I wandered the halls of the estate with only a flashlight, the beam cutting across cobwebs and shadows. The house felt like a mausoleum of unanswered questions, every locked door, another coffin hiding the truth. Something gnawed at me. If my father left his diary behind, what else might still be hidden here? At 2 a.m., I found myself back in the storage wing, rows of boxes stacked so high they bent under their own weight. I dragged one down and tore it open. Bills, more bills. But then beneath a pile of receipts, a folder labeled with my mother's name. My heart pounded as I flipped it open. Letters. Dozens of them. Addressed to me. Never delivered. Her handwriting spilled across each page, uneven and rushed, as if she wrote them in the dead of night, too afraid to say the words aloud. She apologized for the nights she couldn't make dinner, for the days she snapped at me, for the mornings she couldn't get out of bed. She confessed how powerless she felt against my father's gambling and how ashamed she was for letting despair chain her down. And then came the last line of the final letter. "We wanted to come back for you, Danny. We just didn't know how." I collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, clutching the pages like lifelines. It was a truth I hadn't expected, not abandonment, but paralysis. They hadn't stopped loving me. They'd drowned in their own failures. The next morning, Margaret noticed my swollen eyes. She didn't ask. She never asked. But over breakfast, she set her teacup down and said softly, "Strength doesn't always mean holding on. Sometimes it means letting go of the idea that things could have been different." Her words cut deep. Was she warning me or freeing me? School became almost secondary after that. My teachers noticed my distraction. Even Connor noticed, though. He twisted it into mockery. "What's wrong, Daniel?" Finally realizing nobody's coming for you. But instead of breaking me, his words felt almost irrelevant. I had something he couldn't see, my mother's letters pressed against my chest inside my jacket pocket like armor. That week I made a decision. I would piece together my parents' story no matter how ugly or complicated. I owed it to myself to know the full truth, not just fragments hidden in diaries and letters. Yet every step closer brought more unease. Why had Margaret hidden the letters from me all these years? Why had she guarded the house like a fortress, locking away these fragments instead of giving them to me? Was it protection or control? One night, standing in front of the locked east wing door, I pressed my ear against the wood. Faintly, almost like a whisper, I heard the ticking of clocks inside, dozens of them, like hearts beating out of rhythm. I knew then more secrets were waiting, and they weren't going to be gentle. Before I move to the next chapter, I want to pause here. If you found letters like these confessions from parents who vanished, would you cling to them as proof of love or throw them away as proof of weakness? I still don't know if I chose right. Because the truth. Those letters didn't bring me peace. They ignited something else entirely, the hunger to unlock every door, to expose every shadow. And that hunger was about to take me further than I ever imagined. The east wing of the estate had always been off limits. Margaret kept it locked, her stern glare enough to freeze any attempt I'd ever made to question it. But after finding my mother's letters, I couldn't resist. That wing wasn't just a part of the house, it had become a symbol of everything I didn't know, everything they had buried. One stormy night, while Margaret was attending a town council meeting, I stole the keys from her study. My hands shook as I slipped the brass into the ancient lock. The door groaned open, exhaling dust and secrets that had waited years to be disturbed. What I found inside stunned me. Rows of clocks covered every wall, their pendulums swinging in eerie unison. Some chimed weakly, others had long stopped, frozen at random hours. In the center stood a heavy oak desk littered with files, photographs, and most shocking of all, an adoption contract. My name in bold. My breath caught. I wasn't just Margaret's ward, I was legally hers. Signed, sealed, approved. But why had she never told me? Why hide it? I flipped through the papers, finding receipts for special schooling medical bills, with my name scratched out, replaced by codes. And then tucked into an envelope a note from a lawyer. Ensure Daniel remains unaware until the estate is transferred. Transferred to me. My chest tightened. Suddenly everything felt upside down. Had Margaret's cruelty been protection or preparation? Was she forging me into something for her own ends? I sat in that room for hours, the ticking clocks hammering at my skull. Questions piled faster than answers. Why were my parents' debts tied to this estate? Why did Margaret keep the adoption secret? And what was she waiting for? When I finally returned the key and retreated to my room, I felt different. The house no longer seemed like just stone and wood. It was a web, and I was caught in the middle. At school the next day, I couldn't focus. During math class, my pencil snapped from pressing too hard. Connor leaned over with his usual sneer. Careful, unwanted. Push too hard and you'll break. But this time, instead of lashing out, I almost laughed. He had no idea. His cruelty suddenly seemed so small, so insignificant, compared to the labyrinth I was unraveling at home. For the first time, I pitied him. Still, the burden grew heavier. Carrying secrets that could shift my entire identity was like holding a bomb with no timer. At night, I lay awake, replaying my mother's letters and my father's diary, mixing them with the adoption papers. A twisted picture emerged. Maybe my parents hadn't abandoned me at all. Maybe they'd been forced to leave me here, tangled in debts and contracts bigger than themselves. The only person who could answer was Margaret, but asking her outright felt dangerous, like rattling a snake before you were ready to strike. Before I close this chapter, I want to ask you directly, if you uncovered proof that the person who raised you had hidden the truth about your identity, would you confront them immediately or keep digging until you held every piece of the puzzle? Because me, I chose to wait. But that decision would lead me into a revelation I could never have imagined. And once it surfaced, nothing, not Westbridge, not Margaret, not even the memory of my parents would ever look the same again. The discovery in the East Wing haunted me like a shadow I couldn't shake. Every tick of those clocks echoed in my mind, each one whispering a countdown to a truth I wasn't ready to face. Adoption papers, contracts, a lawyer's note. None of it made sense, but all of it confirmed one thing. Margaret hadn't just taken me in, she had claimed me. For days I walked around the estate like a ghost, slipping into classes at school, but barely hearing the lectures. Even Connor's taunts barely landed. He mocked my silence, sneering, "What cat got your tongue?" Or maybe you finally realized you don't belong anywhere. If only he knew how close he was to the truth. At night I returned to the East Wing, searching for more. Behind stacks of ledgers I found photographs, grainy black and white images of my parents standing in front of the estate. They weren't visitors, they looked like owners. One picture especially froze me in place. My father shaking hands with Margaret, both smiling as if sealing a deal. The questions burned hotter. Why would my parents pose with her? Why did they seem so allied? And if they once stood together, what broke them apart? I hid the photograph under my mattress, terrified Margaret would notice it missing. But something about her shifted anyway. Over breakfast one morning, she studied me longer than usual, her spoon poised midair. "You've been wandering," she said, her voice low but sharp. "Curiosity is a dangerous habit, Daniel. Especially in this house." The warning sent a chill through me. Did she know I'd been in the East Wing, or was she simply reminding me of my place? Either way, I nodded, forcing my face into blank obedience. Inside, though, my resolve hardened. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became. Margaret wasn't simply a cold guardian, she was a gatekeeper. And what she guarded wasn't just the estate, it was the story of my entire life. Still, I couldn't ignore the gnawing question, if my parents once stood proudly with Margaret, had I misunderstood their disappearance all along? Could it be that their downfall wasn't abandonment, but betrayal? That thought kept me awake at night. I began scribbling timelines on scraps of paper, trying to connect debts diaries, letters, and contracts into some kind of order. Each line I drew pulled me closer to an answer I wasn't sure I wanted. And here's where I'll turn to you, because this is the moment the ground began to shift beneath me. If you discovered the people you trusted most might have struck a deal with the very person who now controls your life, would you keep digging, or would you stop before the truth destroyed every memory you had left? I didn't stop. I couldn't. Because beneath all the fear and anger, there was one unshakable instinct: something was waiting to be exposed. Something that could shatter the entire foundation of Westbridge Margaret, and maybe even the legacy of my parents. What I didn't know then was that the answers I craved were closer than ever, and once I found them, there would be no turning back. Stay with me. Because the next discovery wasn't just another clue. It was the crack in the dam, and when it burst, everything family loyalty, even love, was swept away. The crack in the dam came faster than I expected. It was a Saturday morning when Margaret summoned me to her study, her tone sharper than usual. She held the photograph I thought I had hidden well under my mattress. My stomach dropped. "You think you're clever," she said, her eyes narrowing, "but you're only a child fumbling in the dark." She slid the photograph across the desk toward me. "Do you even understand what this means?" I stayed silent, my pulse hammering. I didn't trust my voice not to betray me. Margaret leaned back, folding her hands. "Your parents weren't saints. They weren't victims. They made choices that chained them to this house long before you could walk. And when they could no longer pay their debts, they left you here as collateral." The word hit me like a slap. Collateral. I felt the air sucked from my lungs. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but the photograph and papers told their own story. Could it be true that I wasn't abandoned or rescued, but pawned? I staggered back, gripping the edge of a chair. "You're lying," I whispered, though. Even I wasn't convinced. She tilted her head, almost pitying. "Believe what you will, Daniel, but stop digging. Some truths offer no freedom, only chains." That night I lay awake replaying every word. My parents' smiles in that photograph. My father's diary entries about desperation. My mother's letters hinting at burdens I couldn't yet name. Had I built them into heroes simply because the alternative that they sacrificed me was too unbearable? The walls of the estate seemed to close in, pressing with unspoken answers. Even at school, the weight followed me. Connor mocked my vacant stare, but I barely heard him. Instead, I scrawled words across my notebook margins: collateral pawn property. By the third sleepless night, anger burned hotter than grief. If Margaret thought fear would stop me, she had miscalculated. I wasn't her pawn. Not anymore. And this is where I need to ask you, have you ever been told a truth so brutal it threatened to unravel your entire identity? But instead of breaking you, it lit a fire inside you to push harder. That was me. I chose fire. The next day I broke my silence. During dinner with the household staff lingering nearby, I looked Margaret in the eye and said, "You can hide rooms, you can lock away papers, but you can't keep me from finding out why my parents shook your hand that day." Her spoon clattered against the china. For the first time she looked unsettled. Only for a moment, but I saw it, and that glimpse of her fear gave me strength I didn't know I had. In that instant I realized the truth wasn't just hidden in ledgers and contracts. It was etched into Margaret herself. Her silence, her warnings, her slip of the mask, all of it pointed to something bigger than me, bigger than the estate. I didn't yet know the shape of it, but I felt the ground shifting beneath us. And I knew one thing with certainty: the real story of my family wasn't buried in the past. It was alive, pulsing, and about to erupt. Stay with me, because what came next wasn't just revelation, it was confrontation. And once the masks were ripped away, there was no way to put them back on. Confrontation didn't come like thunder, it came like a slow, suffocating storm cloud. After Margaret's slip at the dinner table, I began to watch her as closely as she had always watched me. Every step she took down the long corridors, every hushed word exchanged with the steward, every letter sealed with her wax stamp, I catalogued it all. And then it happened. One evening I heard voices from the drawing room, low and tense. I pressed my ear to the heavy oak door. Margaret's voice sharp, commanding. A man's reply, cautious, almost pleading. "I've kept my end," she hissed. "He remains under my roof. But if the boy learns the full truth, the entire arrangement collapses." The man muttered something I couldn't catch. My blood ran cold. Arrangement. The word echoed like a bell toll. I pushed the door open just enough to glimpse inside. Margaret stood by the fireplace, papers clenched in her fist. The man was the lawyer whose name I had seen on the adoption contract. My heart pounded so loudly I feared they'd hear it. I backed away, breath shallow, until I reached the shadows of the staircase. My chest ached with the weight of what I'd heard. Margaret wasn't just hiding the past, she was maintaining it, feeding it, ensuring it stayed alive. The next morning I confronted her. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "I heard you. The arrangement, the contracts, all of it. What am I to you, Margaret? A son, a servant, or just a ledger entry?" She froze her teacup midair, then calmly she set it down. "You are exactly what you've always been, Daniel," she said. "The heir who was never meant to be, a reminder that debts demand payment." The cruelty in her voice didn't wound me like it once would have. Instead, it clarified everything. If she saw me only as a burden, then she had no power over me anymore. At school I carried myself differently, Connor noticed. "What's with you?" he sneered, finally snapped. I looked him square in the eye. No, finally awake. The words came out steady, and for once he had no reply. But inside the fire blazed hotter. Every discovery, every cruel word, every locked room, it all led to one inevitable conclusion. Margaret's empire was built on lies. And I wasn't just a victim of those lies anymore. I was their undoing. And here's where I want to pull you in, because I have to ask. If you were standing in my shoes, knowing the truth could burn down, not only the house you lived in, but also the last illusions you had of your parents, would you light the match? I had no choice. The lies were already unraveling. Margaret's mask had cracked, and through the fracture I glimpsed not just cruelty, but fear. Fear that I might succeed in uncovering the one truth she couldn't control. I didn't yet know exactly what that truth was, but I knew where to find it in the locked vault beneath the estate. The place she never let me near, the place even the staff whispered about. And so I made my choice. No more silence, no more fear. I would find the key, open the vault, and expose whatever Margaret had buried. What waited inside would decide everything. The night I chose to break into the vault, the estate itself seemed to hold its breath. The The corridors that had once felt oppressive now became accomplices carrying me forward in silence. I had stolen the master key from Margaret's study 2 days earlier, waiting for the perfect moment. Tonight, with the house asleep and rain lashing against the windows, I finally had it. The iron door to the basement groaned as I unlocked it. The air inside was damp metallic, tinged with the smell of paper and rust. My hands trembled as I lifted the lantern higher, casting long, eerie shadows across the stone walls. And then there, it was the vault. A hulking structure of black steel, covered in dust, as if forgotten by time. I slid the key into the lock. For a heartbeat, I feared it wouldn't turn, but then with a reluctant click, it yielded. The door swung open. Inside were boxes upon boxes, stacked high and marked with faded labels. I opened the first one and froze. Ledgers, contracts, documents with signatures. I recognized my parents' names, Margaret's, the lawyers. The truth spilled out in columns of ink, debts, transfers, custodial agreements. My name appeared again and again, not as a child, but as property, collateral. Margaret hadn't lied. But deeper in the vault I found something more. A sealed envelope yellowed with age addressed to me in my mother's handwriting. My hands shook as I tore it open. Daniel, it began. If you are reading this, then Margaret has kept you longer than we ever intended. We were desperate, and in our desperation, we placed you in her care, believing we would return. But debts grew, and so did her hold. We feared she would raise you not as a son, but as a possession. We are sorry. You were never a pawn to us. You were our hope. If you can forgive us and fight for your freedom. Tears blurred the ink. For the first time, I heard my parents' voices not through Margaret's bitter filter, but through their own words. They had been flawed, desperate, but they had loved me. That love was buried under Margaret's chains, but it was real. I clutched the letter to my chest, and in that moment, the fire inside me roared into an inferno. Margaret hadn't just stolen my childhood, she had stolen my parents' last hope. And now I had the proof to destroy her. The next morning, I didn't sneak or hide. I marched into the dining hall where Margaret sat with her tea and spread the documents before her. It's over, I said. The contracts, the ledgers, the letter, they all speak louder than your lies. You don't own me. You never did. For the first time, she didn't have a reply. Her lips pressed thin, her hands trembling ever so slightly. I saw the empire of control she had built begin to crumble in her silence. And here's the truth I want to leave with you. Freedom doesn't always come as a gift. Sometimes it's something you claw out of the darkness piece by piece until the chains fall away. If you followed me this far, you know this isn't just my story, it's a reminder. We are not the debts of our parents, not the contracts others sign in our name. We are more. And no matter how heavy the walls built around us, there's always a way out. So if you're still here listening to my story, let me ask you, what chains are you ready to break in your own life? And when you do, will you walk into the sunlight carrying your scars as proof, or will you leave them buried in the vault? Because me, I chose to carry mine. When I finally walked out of that house, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearing, painted in soft streaks of gold and lavender, as if the world itself was offering a quiet benediction. I carried nothing with me except the letter and a small box of documents. But, for the first time, the weight on my shoulders was not chains. It was wings. Life didn't transform overnight. There were still nights I woke in a cold sweat, still mornings when I half expected Margaret's voice to call my name in that cutting tone. Healing, I learned, wasn't a destination. It was a road winding and uneven. But each step away from that house, each choice I made for myself felt like a reclaiming. I built a new life in small, deliberate ways. A rented apartment with creaky floors that I swept myself. A job where my worth was measured not by control, but by effort. Friendships formed slowly, like cautious plants breaking through hard soil, but they rooted deep. And in quiet moments, I would take out my mother's letter, read her words, and remind myself that love, even imperfect, flawed, desperate love, can outlive manipulation. What Margaret never understood was this freedom isn't simply the absence of chains. It's the courage to decide who you are when no one else is pulling the strings. And in that courage, I found something she could never buy, steal, or forge: peace. If you've listened this far, thank you. This story wasn't just about uncovering secrets or confronting lies. It was about choosing to live as more than someone else's possession. And maybe that's something you can carry into your own life. So I'll leave you with this. What's one step you could take today to move closer to your own freedom? Because sometimes the smallest step is the one that changes everything.